Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Godzilla, or Gojira, from 1954. This is the original Godzilla film and the Japanese version. This comes out at a time in Japan where they're just 2 years out from the American occupation of Japan. They're just starting to recover from World War II. They've had the censorship lifted from their movies, although they were encouraged to have free speech by the American government. They were told not to talk about anything to do with atomic bombs or anything disparaging the American government, or even showing their own military in movies. I think this film represents the new economic growth in Japan, that they could make a film like this, but this also recognizes and kind of contemplates the whole idea of massive attacks on cities and a country that had been extensively firebombed, and the atomic bomb attack as well. Godzilla is more so about that than any of the atomic or nuclear monster movies that came out in this era, and it kind of represented more than just being what people would consider silly monster movies later. It really kind of represented something to a country and was saying something both about the nuclear attacks but also contemplating them and what that meant for the world, and made Godzilla one of the most famous and greatest cinematic monsters of all time. After a fishing boat is just out and suddenly sees a giant flash and is attacked and destroyed, which is much like what happened to the Lucky Dragon ship out in Japan's harbor when America was doing nuclear testing and actually didn't tell Japan they were doing it, and this one fishing boat went out further because they realized there was tons of fish out here and no one else was out here, and unfortunately they got caught in a nuclear blast after a bomb that the US was testing, who they didn't think it would be as destructive as it ultimately was. It gave all the men on that ship radiation poisoning, and one of them actually died of radiation poisoning. The incident at the beginning of this film is very much based on that. And ships keep disappearing in this film, and no one's sure what exactly it is. They just see this glowing light and these ships go down. And slowly they try to assemble a team headed by scientists played by Takashi Shimura. They find out after they go to the island of Odo that it's a monster and his name is Godzilla, that has been a myth on that island for a long time. And he starts attacking more and more ships and eventually coming to land, and they have to find a way to stop him, while the scientist played by Takashi Shimura also acknowledges that he's a very rare creature and we should study him, and they have to just figure out how to stop Godzilla from completely destroying them and coming back to Japan and causing more havoc. Monster movies were actually kind of making a comeback right before this film came out. There was a very successful 1952 re-release of King Kong that was actually more successful than the original release of King Kong. Now, you also have to take into account that re-releases were a bigger deal back then because they didn't have VHS or Netflix or anything like that. So King Kong was really unavailable for almost 20 years. So when people got to see King Kong and the word of mouth had built up, they were very excited for it and they wanted to see more monster movies. And there really weren't a ton of monster movies before this. And then Ray Harryhausen made the film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And that film is kind of a template for Godzilla, and apparently Harryhausen held a lifelong grudge against the Godzilla films. Apparently, I couldn't find too much about it, that's just what I've heard, but Godzilla certainly takes that kind of template, but does a lot more with it. The Godzilla is much more of a destructive force. He much more represents something, and when you see that city on fire, it recalls the fire bombings of Japan. It recalls the atomic bomb when you see the waste he's left after he leaves. When you look at what King Kong did and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, they walk along the street, they mess up a couple buildings, they step on a few people, they're dead, it's over, everybody's fine. But Godzilla, it kind of went on for a while, and he destroyed quite a few things, and he was very destructive. I don't think there was a monster that caused as much destruction at this time in film history as Godzilla. He was an unstoppable force of a monster. A monster destroying a city represented a lot more in Japan than it did anywhere else. I think that's why this film held up so well and started this incredible franchise that went on for so long, because it really represented something for the Japanese. And seeing the horrors that they had all, or a majority of the Japanese had been through, but also gets morally complex. There's tons of ideas going on between, should we kill Godzilla, should we study Godzilla, and also that Godzilla himself is a character that you, the audience, kind of get attached to. You know, not to ruin this very old movie or anything, but Godzilla does die in the end, and at the end, you feel sad. I always feel really kind of depressed at the end of this film because I feel like there was no real way to say what was going to happen. And it feels a lot like what would happen with the atomic bomb. It's like, once you've let that out, look at the uncertain world we live in. They had to kill Godzilla for their own survival, but as he's screaming out in pain, and as you've actually seen him during the battles, like, look at that clock tower, and it looks like he's thinking. That's one of the smartest things, going way back to Felix the Cat in silent film, where you see Felix the Cat thinking, and you as the audience are like, hey, I think sometimes also. He's like me. And that's the same way with Godzilla. You see him thinking, you see him kind of emoting, you see him get angry at things. And when it is time for him to go, and he is screaming in pain, it feels sad. He's both Mother Nature's revenge and the atomic bomb incarnate, but it doesn't make him out to be a one-dimensional villain. This film doesn't have what a lot of blockbusters have and a lot of post-Star Wars films have, where it's triumphant that we've killed the villain. This film isn't triumphant at all. It's like, he's dead. We don't know what's going to happen to us. There could be another Godzilla out there, probably. Well, I mean, there definitely was later, but let's just stick with the ending of this. It's grim. They had to do these things, and even with the oxygen destroyer, yes, they got the oxygen destroyer to go down there, but that scientist killed himself because he didn't want what was going to go out happen and have these arms races that were very much happening at the time. This was scary stuff, and a monster like Godzilla, what that politically meant, in this film, it really represents that. They're really thinking out what this means, what a monster like this would mean, what happens to people when this much destruction happens. It's interesting that a film from 1954 can say that a lot better than blockbusters that destroy half the cities now do. It really understands mass devastation and what that's going to do. And I think it's a very smart movie. It almost has a documentary style, which I also find interesting because I think blockbusters now would love to have made a film as successfully in the style that Godzilla is in, because it has this darky, murky documentary style with kind of this big spectacle of a movie, and it works so well and it means so much politically. I think a lot of blockbuster directors pretend to do that or try to do that, but Ishiro Honda and what he did with Godzilla, no director has really been able to do that as well as Godzilla has. Ishiro Honda, who worked as an assistant director for Akira Kurosawa, and was a great friend of Akira Kurosawa's, was kind of the godfather of the monster movie in Japan. There really weren't monster movies in Japan before this. There were monster movies released in Japan, but none made by Toho, and this was the first one, and he really became the godfather of that. He directed many more Godzilla movies, Godzilla vs. King Kong, Mothra vs. Godzilla, most of the classics of the original series. This is in black and white, the colorful Godzilla that we come to know through a majority of the series isn't really around. I mean, he's only green in advertising and things like that. At this time, he's black and murky and scary. And they got pretty good actors. I mean, Takashi Shimura worked with Akira Kurosawa. He was Akira in Akira, which many have said is one of the best performances of all time. And I think he gives a great performance as, kind of the original good actor playing the scientist who wants to study things. And certainly that was around in monster movies and sci-fi movies at the time, but there were more jerky characters. He's really the contemplation of the piece, who gives kind of the counterpoint to everyone going, we have to kill Godzilla, we're going to die. But he's like, we need to study him. He's lasted so long through radiation. What can we learn from this? It's so much more to this creature than we're giving him credit for. And if you look at any poster of this film, even re-releases, his little head is always on the bottom left corner. They can't not put him on there, and he really deserves it. One thing that's interesting about the Japanese version is it really wasn't released in America until theatrically 2004. And it played at a few festivals in the 80s. I've heard of bootlegs being distributed on VHS between the festival screenings and when it was actually released, but it really wasn't widely available until I think a DVD release in 2006. And they released it as Gojira, and then it became this thing that you should really call him Gojira and not Godzilla. But if you look at a lot of Japanese press for it, and that Toho actually requested that he be called Godzilla in the English language, you really should just call him Godzilla. In most places in the world, he's called Godzilla. And there's actually, on the commentary, I have the Criterion Collection, this guy breaks down why you should just call him Godzilla and goes through what the symbols in Japanese mean and how it basically sounds like Godzilla. You should really go with that. But I kind of understand why you could call it Gojira. It's because there's a film, the release in America with new footage with Raymond Burr. That's called Godzilla King of the Monsters. If you want to call the original Japanese cut, at least in America, Gojira, to recognize a distinction between the two, that I understand, and that's how I believe they re-released the original Japanese cut, is called it Gojira. So I kind of don't really mind it if you're doing it that way, but you really shouldn't call him Gojira because he is Godzilla, and unless you're gonna say the name in Japanese, but it's kind of a stupid nitpicky thing, and if you need to sound pretentious, go with it. This film was actually nominated for the Japanese equivalent of the Academy Award for Best Picture the same year as Seven Samurai, and needless to say, it didn't win. That shows how serious this film is considered in Japan. It's constantly put on lists of the best Japanese movies of all time, and when you look at a film like this, and what it's saying about a country that has been destroyed, they needed a figure to represent that atomic bomb. They needed a figure to represent that destruction. And they used Godzilla to do that. And rather than just having an atomic bomb movie, and he came to represent something at the time, and he really does, you know, he represents an atomic bomb, he shoots fire out of his mouth, which I don't think is coincidental. I think that does kind of represent the fire bombings. He was this monster that kept destroying cities, and these were cities that were not military targets. They were targets because they would go down easily. If you look at the way Godzilla attacks in this film, he attacks targets easily and takes them down, and they weren't really hurting him, but he's mad. He is mad because he was woken up from his slumber. And in a way, I think he could represent America, especially in this film. This is a film that really made me take the franchise more seriously, and I remember the first time I saw it, and I was just shocked. I'm a big Godzilla vs. Mothra fan, and I used to watch a lot of Godzilla movies with my brother, but this made me look at it like, why were we making fun of, you know, when people would say, oh no, Godzilla is attacking and stuff like that. This made me kind of think like, wow, that's incredibly racist, and made me think about why this film was made in the first place. And I had only seen the Raymond Burr version, and seeing this woke me up that there's a reason this franchise started and became so successful. It took it a while to be regarded as well as it is today. Even Japanese critics didn't really like it. They considered it junk, and same with American critics. Ebert still didn't really, kind of begrudgingly kind of gave it kudos in a review I read. When you watch this version, it kind of made me think about what this represented to the Japanese people and what they had gone through. When I watch this film, it makes me think about that, but also makes me think about the monster and feel for the monster. And I think the best monster movies, you look at even King Kong, that monster has a personality. And for them to both show the destruction that they had been through, but also not completely vilify it, shows the kind of maturity and the strength of the characters behind this, and especially the strength of the character behind Godzilla. And I think Ishiro Honda directed a really amazing monster movie that I don't know if there's still that many monster movies that are better than this original film, the Japanese cut. I just remember after I'd seen it the first time, I just couldn't get over how good it was. And it's definitely probably my favorite monster movie of all time. I never thought monster movies could do this other than being kind of a guilty pleasure, and it makes you kind of reassess why these things became popular. This made me look at the American occupation of Japan and look at what was going on at the time and look at the Lucky Dragon ship. Every time I think about the politics around this film or what happened to this fictional character of Godzilla, maybe he is a conduit for a lot of different things. He really is. I mean, he represents a lot of things for one character. This will always be one of the best monster movies ever made. I think that shows the power of this original 1954 film more than anything, that all these years later and on its American re-release, it could just take all these kids who'd grown up with Godzilla and lived with Godzilla and grown up with a certain connotation of Godzilla, and the genre has gone through so many iterations and so many sequels, and the character's been maligned and has Godzuki and everything like that. This film can still grab you as hard as it did probably in 1954. So if you have seen Godzilla from 1954 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.